Hello, Night Seekers, and welcome to Lacuna Noir. This is where forgotten stories and gentle voices meet, carrying you softly into peaceful sleep, wrapped in mystery. Before tonight's stories begin, I'd love to know, where in the world are you listening from? Drop a comment below and let me know. And a little note before we begin. You may notice a few brief ads in the first 10 minutes, but after that, the rest of the video is completely ad-free. Just you, the silence, and the stories. So settle in, get comfortable, and let the night carry you. If you're drawn to these quiet, shadowed nights, don't forget to like, subscribe, and tap the bell so you never miss a story when darkness calls. I used to know this guy named Brandon, and even now, years later, his story still sticks with me in a way that's hard to explain. It wasn't just what happened to him, but the way it seemed to follow him around, shaping everything about who he became. At the time, I didn't fully understand it. I just knew there was something off about him, something that made people uncomfortable, even when they couldn't quite say why. When I first met him, he seemed like a normal enough guy. Quiet, maybe a little distant, but not in a way that stood out too much. The kind of person who didn't say much unless he had to, who stayed on the edge of conversations rather than in the middle of them. If you didn't know anything about his past, you probably wouldn't think twice about him. But once you learned what he had been through, it was hard to look at him the same way again. I didn't hear his story from him directly. It was something that came up slowly, piece by piece, from other people who had known him longer than I had. At first, it sounded like one of those rumors that gets passed around and exaggerated over time. But the more I heard, the more consistent the details were, and eventually it became clear that it wasn't just gossip. It had really happened. His dad had been abusive, not just in the way people sometimes casually use that word, but in a way that had clearly left a deep mark on everyone in that house. From what I was told, it had been going on for years. His mom had tried to hold things together for as long as she could, but eventually it reached a point where she couldn't stay anymore. She made the decision to leave, which in most situations, it would already be difficult enough. But in this case, it turned into something far worse. The day she went back to the house to get her things, she didn't go alone. She brought her best friend with her, and there was also a police officer there to make sure nothing got out of hand. I remember thinking, when I first heard that part, that it sounded like the kind of precaution people take when they know something could go wrong. Like there was already a sense of danger in the air before anything even happened. They went inside together. From the outside, it probably looked like a normal situation, just a tense one. No one passing by would have had any idea what was about to happen in that house. But once they were inside, everything changed in a matter of seconds. Brandon's dad didn't argue, didn't try to talk things out. At least, not from what anyone ever said. Instead, he pulled out a gun. There was no warning, no time for anyone to react properly. The police officer was the first to be shot, then the friend, then his mom, and after that, he turned the gun on himself. It was over almost as quickly as it had started. 4 people gone in a matter of moments, all inside a place that was supposed to be familiar, even if it wasn't safe. Whenever I think about it, what stands out the most is how sudden it must have felt for everyone involved. One moment they were walking into that house, maybe nervous, but still thinking they would leave. The next moment, everything was gone. Brandon was still a kid when it happened. I don't know exactly where he was at the time, whether he saw any of it or just heard about it afterward. Different people told it slightly differently. And that part was never completely clear. But either way, it didn't really matter. Something like that doesn't just pass through a person and leave them the same. When I finally connected the story to him, it explained a lot about the way he acted. Not in a way that made it okay, but in a way that made it make sense, at least on the surface. There was always this feeling around him like he was carrying something heavy that never really went away. He didn't talk about his family, ever. If the topic came up, he would either go quiet or find a way to change the subject quickly. At first, I felt sorry for him. I think most people did once they knew. It's hard not to feel something when you hear about a childhood like that, especially something so violent and final. There's a natural instinct to give someone the benefit of the doubt, to assume that whatever is wrong with them comes from a place of pain. But as time went on, it became harder to ignore the way he treated people, especially women. There was a pattern to it that made people uncomfortable. He didn't date people his own age. He consistently went after girls who were younger, sometimes much younger. At first, people tried to brush it off or make excuses, but it kept happening. It wasn't just a one-time mistake or something you could explain away. It became a regular thing. Every time someone thought he might have learned his lesson, he would do it again. There were situations where parents got involved, where they made it very clear that he was not welcome anywhere near their daughters. Some of them threatened to call the police. Others were more direct, by saying things that made it clear they were ready to take matters into their own hands if he didn't stay away. And still, nothing really changed. It was like he was stuck in some kind of loop, repeating the same behavior no matter what consequences came with it. People would confront him, try to talk sense into him, even try to help in some cases. But it never seemed to get through. He would nod along, act like he understood, and then not long after, something else would happen. Being around him started to feel different. That initial sympathy people had slowly turned into something else. Uneasiness, maybe even fear. Not the kind of fear that comes from an immediate threat, but something quieter, something that builds over time when you realize a person doesn't respond to normal boundaries the way they should. I remember one time someone tried to explain it by saying that whatever had happened in his childhood had frozen part of him in place, like he never really moved past a certain point. I don't know if that's true or just something people say to make sense of things that don't have easy explanations, but it did feel like he was disconnected from the normal way people grow and change. What made it harder was that he didn't always come across as obviously dangerous. In regular situations, he could seem almost normal. He could joke, hold a conversation, even be friendly in a quiet sort of way. And then something would happen that reminded you that there was another side to him, something that didn't line up with everything else. Over time, people started to distance themselves from him. Not all at once, but gradually. Invitations stopped coming his way. Conversations became shorter. There was this unspoken understanding that it was better not to get too close, not to give him too much space in your life. The last time I heard anything about him, he was still the same. Still getting himself into trouble, still ignoring the warnings, still acting in ways that pushed people further away. It didn't seem like anything had really changed, even after everything he had been through and everything that had happened since. Sometimes I think about how different things might have been if his childhood had been different, if that one day hadn't ended the way it did. But at the same time, there's a point where you can't keep tying everything back to the past. People are responsible for what they do, no matter where they come from. What stays with me the most isn't just the story itself, but the feeling that came with knowing him. That sense that some things don't just end when they're over, that they keep moving forward in quieter ways, shaping what comes next. And sometimes the result is something you can't quite fix or fully understand, no matter how much you try. I have a friend whose story is a little similar in some ways, and it's one of those things that stays in the back of your mind even when you're not actively thinking about it. It doesn't come up often, and he almost never talks about it, but once you know, it changes the way you see certain quiet moments with him. Not in a negative way, just in a way that makes everything feel a little heavier, like there's something beneath the surface that most people will never fully understand. His parents had been separated for a while before everything happened. From what I understand, it wasn't a peaceful separation, but it also wasn't something that stood out as completely out of control to people on the outside. His dad had moved on and was living with someone else, a new wife. And for a while, it probably looked like things were settling into a different kind of normal. At least that's how it must have seemed to anyone who didn't know the details. But behind that, there were problems. The kind that build slowly and don't always show themselves clearly until it's too late. There were arguments, tension, things that weren't being resolved. I don't know exactly how long it had been going on, and honestly, I don't think anyone outside that house ever really knew the full picture. It's one of those situations where people only start putting the pieces together after something terrible has already happened. At some point, things got bad enough that his stepmom decided she needed help just to go back into the house and get her things. She had planned to have a police officer there with her, just to make sure nothing could escalate. That alone says a lot about the kind of fear or concern she must have been feeling. People don't usually take that step unless they believe something could go very wrong. But then, for whatever reason, she changed her mind. Maybe she thought bringing a cop would make things more tense. Maybe she hoped it wouldn't be as bad as she feared. Maybe she just wanted to handle it quietly and move on. It's impossible to know what she was thinking in that moment. But that decision ended up being the kind of thing you can't help going back to later and wondering about. She went there without anyone else. What happened next didn't take long. There wasn't some drawn-out situation where people had time to react or get help. His dad attacked her, and it turned violent very quickly. He stabbed her, and she didn't survive. Just like that, everything that had been building quietly in the background turned into something final and irreversible. After that, instead of staying or trying to run or face what he had done, his dad left the house and walked out into traffic. It wasn't something accidental. He did it on purpose. He stepped into the road in a way that made it clear what he intended, and it ended his life there. It's hard to imagine the mindset someone has to be in to do something like that. To go from whatever was happening inside that house to making that kind of decision so quickly. It doesn't really make sense in a way that you can neatly explain. It just leaves behind a lot of questions that don't have clear answers. But the part that always hits the hardest is what happened just before that. He called my friend. My friend was only 15 at the time. Still a kid. Still at an age where you're trying to figure out who you are, where your place is in the world. And in the middle of all of that, he gets a call from his dad, who tells him what he's done and what he's about to do. Not because he wanted comfort or help, but because he didn't want to go to jail. That detail is the one that's hardest to sit with. The idea that in his final moments, instead of thinking about what that call would do to his son, he was focused on escaping the consequences. It puts something on a 15-year-old that no one should ever have to carry. I don't know exactly what was said in that call. I've never asked, and I never will. It's not the kind of thing you dig into, especially when someone has made it clear in the way they live their life that they don't want to revisit it. But even without knowing the exact words, it's easy to imagine how confusing and overwhelming that moment must have been. Getting a call like that, not knowing how to respond, not having time to process it, and then realizing that everything your dad just said is real. It's the kind of thing that doesn't just pass. It stays with you, whether you talk about it or not. By the time I met him, it was years later. We were in college, in a completely different environment, surrounded by people who were mostly focused on normal things like classes, plans, and figuring out the future. If you didn't know his past, you would never guess it from the way he carried himself. He's genuinely a great person. Calm, thoughtful, the kind of friend who listens more than he talks. He doesn't try to draw attention to himself, and he doesn't act like someone who wants sympathy. In fact, it's almost the opposite. He keeps things close, and there's a quiet strength in the way he moves through life. He never brings up what happened. Not casually, not seriously. Not even in moments when other people are sharing difficult experiences. It's just not something he opens the door to, and no one who cares about him would try to force that door open. But every now and then, there are small moments where you can feel that something is there. Not in an obvious way, but in the way he pauses before answering certain questions, or how he sometimes looks like he's somewhere else for a second before coming back to the present. It's subtle, and if you weren't paying attention, you might miss it completely. Those moments don't make me see him as broken. If anything, they make me respect him more. Because whatever he went through, whatever he had to process at such a young age, he didn't let it turn him into someone who hurts others. He didn't repeat the same patterns. He chose a different path, even if it meant carrying something heavy along the way. It's strange how two people can come from situations that have similar elements and end up so different. Where one person might spiral into something harmful, another might hold on to their sense of who they want to be and refuse to let the past define them in that way. There's no simple explanation for why that happens. It's not something you can reduce to one reason or one turning point. Sometimes I catch myself thinking about that day, even though it didn't happen to me. I'm just trying to imagine what it must have been like for him. Sitting there at 15, hearing his dad's voice on the phone, not knowing how to respond, and then having to live with that moment afterward. It's the kind of thing that doesn't just fade into the background. And then I think about who he is now, how he treats people, how he shows up as a friend, and it makes everything feel even more intense in a different way, because it's not just a tragic story. It's also a reminder that people are more than the worst things that have happened around them. Still, every time the thought crosses my mind, there's this quiet ache that comes with it. Not because I see him differently in a negative way, but because I know there's a part of his life that no amount of time can fully erase. And even if he never talks about it, even if he's built a life that looks steady and strong from the outside, that moment is still there somewhere, like a shadow that never fully disappears. I don't bring it up. I don't treat him any differently because of it. But it's always in the back of my mind, in a quiet way that never really goes away. And every time I think about it, it makes me appreciate him more, while at the same time wishing that he had never had to go through something like that at all. My grandpa used to tell me this story every now and then. He never told it in a dramatic way, never tried to make it sound bigger than it was. It always came out slowly, like he was just remembering something that had stayed with him for a long time. The way he spoke about it made it feel real in a different way, not like a story meant to scare you, but like something that had actually happened and never really left him. He worked in the oil and gas industry when he was younger, back at a time when safety rules weren't as strict or as clearly understood as they are today. It was the kind of work where people relied more on experience than proper systems, and sometimes that meant learning things the hard way. Mistakes weren't always small. Sometimes they cost people their lives. His father owned the company he worked for, so he had grown up around that environment. He knew the sights, the machinery, the routines. To him, it was all normal. The smell of oil, the constant hum of equipment, the sight of workers moving through the site like they had done it 1,000 times before. It was just part of his life. But every so often, something would happen that reminded everyone how dangerous that work really was. Not in an obvious way, not with explosions or loud accidents, but in quieter ways that were harder to notice until it was too late. He told me about these massive tanks they used. The way he described them, they sounded almost like giant metal towers rising out of the ground. From a distance, they didn't look like anything special, just big, solid structures, sitting there quietly, like they had always been there and always would be. There was nothing about them that would make you think they were dangerous, but inside, they could hold substances most people would never think about. Things you couldn't see, sometimes couldn't even smell, but that could still kill you in seconds if you didn't know they were there. One of those tanks had developed a buildup of gas inside it. It wasn't obvious. Back then, they didn't have the same equipment or systems to detect it properly. The gas was heavier than oxygen, which meant it didn't rise or mix the way people might expect. Instead, it settled low, forming a layer inside the tank. From the top, it would have looked like normal air. There was no color, no movement, nothing to warn you. At some point, one of the workers was sent to measure the inside of the tank. It was a routine task, like something they had probably done many times before. There was no reason for him to think that day would be any different. He climbed down the ladder slowly, one step at a time, heading deeper into the tank. From above, anyone watching would have seen nothing unusual, just a man doing his job. But as he got lower, he started breathing in that gas without realizing it. There was no warning, no sudden smell, no burning in his lungs, nothing that would make him stop and think. It just replaced the air he needed, quietly, completely. He never came back up. When people noticed he had been gone longer than expected, another worker went to check on him. That part always stayed with me. His first instinct wasn't fear, it was concern. He probably thought something simple had happened, that the man had slipped, or maybe gotten stuck, something that could be fixed. So he climbed down after him. Step by step, he went into the same space, breathing the same invisible gas. Just like the first man, he didn't realize what he was walking into. Whatever he felt, it must have come on quickly. Maybe a sudden dizziness, maybe a moment of confusion, and then nothing. He lost consciousness and fell from the ladder, dropping to the bottom where the first man already lay. Now there were two of them. When the second man didn't return, someone else went to check. The same thing happened again. Concern turned into action, and action led straight into the same danger. He climbed down, unaware of what had already happened. From above, it still looked like an empty tank. There was nothing to show that the air itself had become deadly. Nothing to warn him to stay away. He didn't make it out either. 3 men, one after another, all gone in the same place, each of them trying to help the one before him, not knowing they were stepping into the same trap. My grandpa said that by the time he got there, something felt wrong. He never fully explained what it was. Maybe it was the silence, the fact that no one had come back up. Maybe it was just a feeling, something that made him stop before doing what the others had done. He walked up to the edge of the tank and looked inside. At the bottom, he could see them. 3 bodies lying still in a place that had seemed harmless just a short time before. There was no movement, no signs of struggle from where he stood. That was what made it worse. It didn't look violent. It didn't look like anything had happened at all. Just stillness. He didn't go down after them, and by then they must have realized that whatever was inside that tank wasn't safe. They had to stop, think, find another way. But the damage had already been done. When he told the story, he always explained it in a practical way. He said it was because the gas had displaced the oxygen, that the men had simply run out of air without realizing it. He never tried to make it sound mysterious or strange, but there was something about it that stayed with you. Maybe it was how quietly it happened. No noise, no warning, no sign from the outside. Just one person going down, then another, each one thinking they were helping. Or maybe it was the idea that something so normal, something as simple as air, could turn into something deadly without anyone noticing. After that incident, things started to change. They began adding proper ventilation to those tanks. They made sure gases couldn't build up the same way again. Safety procedures became stricter, more careful, more thought out. It didn't bring those men back, but it meant fewer people would end up in the same situation. Even with those changes, though, the story never left him. You could hear it in the way he talked about it, in the pauses between his words, in the way he would sometimes stop for a moment before continuing. It wasn't just something that had happened at work. It was something that had stayed with him. And hearing it years later, it stayed with me, too. Not just because of what happened, but because of how it happened. The fact that each man went in trying to help, not knowing they were walking into something deadly. The fact that it all took place in a space that looked completely normal from the outside is the kind of story that doesn't need anything supernatural to feel unsettling. Everything about it is real. It makes sense. And that's what makes it harder to forget. Because it means something like that could happen anywhere, under the right conditions, without anyone realizing until it's too late. Sometimes I still picture it, the way he described it. Not loud, not chaotic, but quiet. That tall metal tank standing there like it always had, unchanged, unmoving. And inside it, something you couldn't see at all. Something that looked just like air. Something that wasn't. My wife was driving home late one night after work. The kind of night where everything feels unusually quiet, like the world has slowed down and settled into itself. And it was one of those long, drawn-out evenings where the hours seem to stretch, and by the time you're finally heading home, your body feels heavy with exhaustion. She had worked a full shift, the kind that leaves your mind tired just as much as your body, and all she wanted was to get back to the house, see the kids, and finally relax. The roads were mostly empty. Every now and then a car would pass in the opposite direction, headlights cutting through the darkness for a brief moment before fading away again. There was something calm about it, something almost peaceful. The steady sound of the engine, the soft glow of streetlights passing one by one, the familiar route she had taken countless times before. It was routine, predictable, the kind of drive you don't really think about because you've done it so many times. She told me later that nothing felt unusual at all. There were no strange signs, no sudden feelings of unease, nothing that hinted that anything was about to go wrong. It was just another night, another drive home, just like all the others. As she got closer to one of the overpasses along her route, everything still felt exactly the same. The road stretched ahead of her, empty and quiet. The streetlights cast long shadows across the pavement, and the air felt still. If you had been there watching from a distance, you wouldn't have noticed anything out of place. Just a single vehicle moving steadily through the night. I passing under a bridge like it had done 100 times before. And then, without any warning at all, everything changed. She said it happened so fast that her mind didn't even have time to catch up. 1 second, she was driving normally, focused on the road ahead, and the next there was a sudden, violent crash against the side of the van. The sound was loud and sharp, like something had slammed into the vehicle with full force. It wasn't just a noise you hear and move on from. It was the kind of sound that seems to echo inside your chest, the kind that makes your heart jump before you even understand what's happening. The impact hit the passenger side. That detail has stayed with me ever since she told me. Not just that something hit the van, but exactly where it hit. A small difference, just a matter of inches. I could have changed everything. If it had come down a little differently, if the angle had been slightly off, it could have gone straight through the windshield. It could have hit her directly. It could have turned that quiet drive home into something we never recovered from. But it didn't. The van jerked slightly from the force, and for a moment she didn't even know what had happened. Her hands tightened on the steering wheel, her heart racing as she tried to stay in control. There's that strange moment after something unexpected happens, where everything feels disconnected, like your body is reacting before your mind has caught up. She slowed the vehicle as carefully as she could, pulling over to the side of the road, her thoughts scrambling to make sense of what had just occurred. She sat there for a second, just breathing, listening to the quiet again. The engine was still running, the road still empty, but something had changed. That calm feeling from before was gone, replaced by a kind of tension that didn't have a clear source yet. When she finally stepped out of the van and walked around to the passenger side, that's when it became real. There, on the ground, was a large rock, not something small that might have bounced up from the road, not loose gravel or debris. This was something heavy, something solid, something that didn't belong there. Even without knowing exactly how it got there, it was obvious that it hadn't just fallen by accident. It was the kind of object that, if it had hit at a slightly different angle, could have gone straight through the glass. She looked up at the overpass above her. That's when it started to make sense. At some point, someone had been standing up there, looking down at the road below. They had picked up that rock, held it over the edge, and dropped it. Not because they were aiming at her specifically, not because they knew who she was, but because they decided to do it. Maybe they thought it would be funny. Maybe they didn't think at all. That's the part that's hardest to sit with, the randomness of it. The idea that someone could make a choice like that without fully understanding what it could do. That there were real people driving below, people with lives, families, routines, people who trusted that something as simple as driving home wouldn't turn into something dangerous in a split second. We have 4 kids. That thought comes back to me every time I think about that night. Not just what happened, but what could have happened. How close it came to being something completely different. It's strange how your mind works in moments like that. How it starts filling in the gaps with possibilities you can't ignore. I picture the same scene, but slightly different. The rock coming down at a different angle. The windshield shattering instead of the side taking the hit. The outcome changing in a way that no one could fix. It's not something you can just brush off. People say she was lucky, and they're right. She walked away without a single scratch. The van took the damage, not her. But luck feels like a fragile thing when you realize how close it came. It doesn't feel comforting. It feels thin, like something that could have easily gone the other way. When the police got involved, there wasn't much they could do. By the time anyone knew what had happened, whoever had been on that overpass was gone. There were no clear descriptions, no way to track them down. It had happened too quickly, and the night had swallowed up any chance of finding out who was responsible. That was one of the strangest parts of it all. Something so serious, something that could have ended in tragedy, and yet there was no real resolution. No answers, no consequences that we could see. Just the knowledge that it had happened and that it could happen again. Eventually, things returned to normal, at least on the surface. The van was repaired. The routines came back: work, school, daily life. The same roads, the same drive home late at night. From the outside, everything looked exactly the same as it had before, but it didn't feel the same. There's a certain awareness that settles in after something like that. A quiet thought that stays in the back of your mind even when you're not actively thinking about it. The understanding that normal moments aren't as guaranteed as they seem. That something simple, something routine, can change without warning because of a decision made by someone else. She still drives that route sometimes. There isn't really a way around it. And life doesn't give you the option to avoid every place that holds a bad memory. But I know that when she gets close to that overpass, she notices it. Even if she doesn't say anything, even if it's just for a second. I know I would. It's not exactly fear. It's something quieter than that. More like a reminder that sits just below the surface. A reminder of how fragile things really are, even when they feel stable. The part that stays with me the most isn't the impact itself. It's the realization of how small the difference was between what happened and what could have happened. How something as random as a rock falling from above could have changed everything in an instant. And how the people responsible probably walked away from it without ever fully understanding just how close they came to destroying someone else's life. That's what makes it linger. Not the event itself, but the space around it. The narrow gap between a normal night and something much worse. The kind of thing you don't think about until it happens. And once it does, you don't really stop thinking about it. Back in the early 2000s, this kind of thing wasn't as rare as people would like to believe. It's strange to think about now, but there was a period where stories like this kept showing up again and again, almost like a pattern that people slowly began to notice. It wasn't happening everywhere all the time, and it wasn't something people talked about every day, but it happened often enough that once you heard about it, you didn't really forget it. Kids would go up onto pedestrian bridges that crossed over highways and busy roads. From up there, they could look down at the steady flow of cars passing underneath. Headlights stretching out in long lines at night, or sunlight reflecting off windshields during the day. To them, it probably felt harmless at first, just standing there, watching the traffic move below, maybe laughing with friends, maybe trying to pass the time. And then, for reasons that are still hard to fully understand, they would start dropping things. Sometimes it was small stuff. Empty bottles, pieces of trash, anything they could easily hold and toss over the edge. Things that might hit a car and make a sound. Maybe startle someone, but not cause real damage. At least that's how it might have seemed in their minds. But other times, it wasn't small at all. Sometimes it was rocks. Not tiny stones or loose gravel that would scatter on impact, but solid, heavy chunks. The kind you have to lift with both hands. The kind that has weight to it. And from that height, even something that doesn't seem that dangerous suddenly becomes something else entirely. Gravity does the rest. By the time it reaches the road below, it's no longer just a rock. It's something moving fast enough to break through glass, to hit with a force that no one inside a car could ever prepare for. And the worst part is that it didn't always end with just a loud noise or a cracked windshield. Sometimes it ended in ways that couldn't be undone. I remember being really young when I first heard about one of those cases. It came on the news, one of those stories that interrupts whatever you're watching and shifts the mood instantly. I don't remember what I had been doing before it came on, but I remember how it felt when I started paying attention. Even as a kid, there was something about the tone of it that made it clear this wasn't just another random report. Back then, I didn't fully understand how something like that could even happen. The world still felt simple and predictable in the way it often does when you're young. Bad things existed, sure, but they felt distant, like they belonged somewhere else. The story was about a woman driving with her baby in the car. From what I remember, it was a normal day. The kind of day no one would think twice about. She was just going about her routine, maybe running errands, maybe heading home after being out. The road she was on wasn't unusual. It was just another stretch of highway, like the kind thousands of people use every day without thinking about it. Everything about it was ordinary, until it wasn't. Someone was standing on a bridge above that road. They dropped a rock. It came down with a speed and force that no one inside the car could have anticipated. Windshields are meant to protect you from things on the road, from debris that might come up from below, but they aren't built for something like that falling from above at that height. The impact wasn't just a crack. It wasn't something that gave a warning. It shattered straight through. One moment, the glass was there. The next moment, it wasn't. The rock didn't stop at the windshield. It hit the baby. Even now, thinking about that part feels heavy in a way that's hard to put into words. At the time, I didn't fully understand what it meant. I just knew it was serious, that it was the kind of thing adults spoke about in quieter voices afterward. But as you get older, your understanding changes. You begin to see the full weight of it, how something so small in the moment of action can have such a permanent outcome. It wasn't just the impact itself. It was everything that came after. The woman lost control of the car. That part always made sense to me, even when I was younger. Something like that doesn't happen without causing chaos. The shock alone would be enough. The confusion, the panic, the sudden realization that something is terribly wrong. It's not something anyone is trained to handle. The car veered. Other vehicles were on the road. There was no time to think, no time to correct things in a calm, controlled way. What started as a single act from above turned into something much larger. An accident followed. Not just one moment, but a chain reaction. The kind of situation where everything unfolds too quickly for anyone to fully understand what's happening until it's already over. And then, just like that, it was done. The story didn't end with clear answers either. From what I remember, the people responsible were never caught. That part stuck with me in a different way. The idea that something so serious, something that caused so much damage, could just exist without closure. No clear ending, no accountability, just something that happened and then became a story people told. A warning more than anything. As I got older, I didn't think about it all the time. Life has a way of moving forward, of filling your mind with other things. School, work, everyday routines. You don't spend your days constantly thinking about the worst things that could happen. But some stories don't fully leave you. They settle somewhere in the back of your mind, quiet and almost invisible most of the time. You don't notice them until something brings them back. For me, it was always the same kind of moment. Driving under a pedestrian bridge. And it doesn't matter how many times you've done it before. It doesn't matter how normal it should feel. There's always that small shift as you approach. At first, you're just focused on the road ahead, on the flow of traffic, on whatever destination you're heading toward. And then, without really deciding to, you look up. It's quick, just a glance. You check the edges of the bridge, the railing, the space where someone could be standing. You don't always expect to see anything, and most of the time you don't. But the fact that you look at all is what stands out. It's automatic. If the bridge has protective netting or barriers, something that clearly blocks anything from falling through, the feeling's different. There's a sense of reassurance, even if you weren't fully aware you needed it. But if there's nothing there, if it's just open space between the railing bars, that quiet tension builds a little more. It's not panic. It's not the kind of fear that makes your heart race or your hands shake. It's quieter than that. A subtle awareness that something could happen, even if it probably won't. A reminder that the ordinary world isn't always as controlled as it seems. That there are small gaps where things can go wrong in ways you don't expect. Most of the time, nothing does happen. You pass under the bridge, the light shifts for a second, and then you're on the other side. The road continues. Everything feels normal again, and whatever thought crossed your mind fades back into the background. But it never fully disappears. It just waits. Next time you approach a bridge, it comes back. That same small glance upward. That same quiet check. It doesn't matter how many times you've done it safely before. The possibility, once you're aware of it, doesn't go away. That's what makes it stay with you. Not just the story itself, but the way it changes how you see something so simple. A bridge isn't just a bridge anymore. It's something you pay attention to in a different way. Something that carries a memory with it. And even years later, even after countless normal drives where nothing happens at all, that brief moment of looking up as you pass underneath still carries a feeling you can't quite shake. It's small, almost nothing, but it's always there. I was about 10 years old when it happened, and even now it's one of those memories that hasn't faded the way most childhood moments do. A lot of things from that age become blurry over time, like they belong to someone else's life. But this one stayed sharp. Not because of how long it lasted, but because of how heavy it became afterward. It was supposed to be a normal, happy kind of memory. I had gone over to a friend's house for his birthday, and at that age, that was something you looked forward to for days. Staying up late, playing games, eating junk food, laughing over things that probably wouldn't even make sense now. It felt simple, safe, like nothing outside that moment really mattered. I remember the house being full of noise the night before. Not chaotic, just the kind of energy kids have when they're excited and don't want the night to end. We stayed up longer than we should have, talking about random things, joking around, probably making plans we would forget by the next day. Eventually, though, the energy faded. One by one, everyone got tired, and the house settled into that quiet stillness that comes after a long day. I don't remember falling asleep exactly, just that feeling of being comfortable, knowing you're somewhere familiar enough, surrounded by people you trust. At 10 years old, that's enough to make the world feel completely okay. The next morning felt just as normal. We woke up early, the way kids do, even after staying up too late. There was still that leftover excitement from the night before, like the fun hadn't completely ended yet. We went outside pretty quickly, not one to waste the day sitting inside. The front yard was where we ended up, just messing around, talking, doing whatever came to mind without much thought. It was the kind of morning where nothing feels urgent. No responsibilities, no real plans. Just time to fill. At some point, one of the neighborhood kids came over. He wasn't part of the birthday sleepover, just someone who lived nearby. I didn't know him that well. He was more my friend's friend than mine, someone I had seen around but never really spent much time with. He seemed normal. That's the part that always comes back to me. There was nothing unusual about him in that moment. Nothing that stood out or gave any kind of warning. He just walked up, joined the conversation like it was any other day, like he had done it 100 times before. After a little while, he asked us if we wanted to go to the local Quickie Mart. It wasn't far. Less than a mile, maybe. The kind of place kids in a neighborhood would go to all the time without thinking much about it. We would have had to ride our bikes, which was normal too. At that age, a short bike ride felt like a small adventure, even if it was just to get snacks or drinks. My friend turned to me and asked if I wanted to go. I don't remember thinking about it very hard. It wasn't some big decision. It was just a simple question in a simple moment. For whatever reason, I said no. Maybe I didn't feel like riding. Maybe I was comfortable where I was. Maybe it was nothing more than a passing feeling that I didn't want to move. He looked at me for a second, then shrugged and said we'd just stay. That was it. The other kid got on his bike and left on his own. There was nothing dramatic about it. No hesitation. No sense that anything important was happening. He just rode off down the street, heading in the direction of the store. We probably watched him go for a few seconds before going back to whatever we were doing. At the time, it meant nothing. It was just another moment in a normal day. We were the last people to see him alive. That part didn't come until later. Much later, after everything had already happened, after the normal feeling of that morning had been completely replaced by something else. I don't remember exactly when we found out something was wrong. It didn't happen right away. At first, it was just confusion. People asking questions, noticing that he hadn't come back yet. Maybe someone thought he had stopped somewhere else or gone to a different friend's house. But as more time passed, the mood started to change. Adults got involved. Conversations became quieter, more serious. The kind of tone that kids notice even if they don't fully understand it. You could feel it in the way people spoke, in the way they looked at each other, like something wasn't right, but no one wanted to say it out loud yet. Then it became clear. He hadn't made it to the store. Somewhere along the way, something had happened. The details didn't come all at once. They never do. At first, it was just the fact that he was missing. Then the search started. People looking, calling, hoping it was all some kind of misunderstanding. But it wasn't. They found him later behind someone's fence. Even now, that part is hard to think about without feeling a kind of heaviness that doesn't go away. He had been taken. Now hurt in ways no one should ever be hurt. And then killed. I mean, it's strange how your mind reacts to something like that, especially when you're that young. You don't have the words for it. You don't fully understand what it means, but you know it's bad in a way that goes beyond anything you've experienced before. For a long time, it didn't feel real. It felt like something that happened in a different world, not the same one where we had been standing in that yard just hours before. The idea that a normal morning could turn into something like that didn't fit with how I saw things at the time. But as the reality settled in, something else came with it. a question, one that never really went away. What if I had said yes? Sounds simple, but it isn't. At first, it came as a passing thought, just a small what if that crossed my mind and then disappeared. But over time, it stayed longer. It started to take shape, to turn into something heavier. If I had gone, things would have been different. That much is obvious. But different how? There are only a few possibilities, and none of them feel right. Maybe nothing would have happened. Maybe 3 kids riding together would have been enough to prevent it. Maybe whoever did it wouldn't have approached a group. Maybe we all would have gone to the store, bought whatever we wanted, and come back like it was any other day. That's one version. The one that's easier to think about. But there's another version, too. One where it still happens. One where being there doesn't change anything except that there are more people involved, more victims, more lives affected. And that's the part that makes it hard, because there's no way to know. You can't go back and see how it would have played out. You can't test a different choice and compare the outcome. All you're left with is the question itself, repeating over and over in slightly different ways. As I got older, I understood more about what had happened, about the kind of person who could do something like that, about how unpredictable and senseless those actions can be. And with that understanding came the realization that it probably had nothing to do with me, that my choice that morning, simple as it was, didn't cause what happened. But knowing that and feeling that are 2 different things. The feeling doesn't always listen to logic. It stays there, quiet but persistent, showing up at unexpected times. When you think about the past, when something reminds you of that day, when you see kids riding their bikes together, laughing, not thinking about anything beyond the moment they're in, it makes you realize how thin the line is between a normal day and something that changes everything. How quickly things can shift without warning. And how sometimes the smallest decisions, the ones that feel meaningless at the time, end up sitting at the center of memories that never really let you go. I don't think that feeling ever fully disappears. It just becomes part of the way you see things. A quiet reminder of a morning that started like any other. And a moment where a simple no became something I would think about for the rest of my life. I grew up in a neighborhood where everyone knew each other. It was the kind of place where people didn't think twice about helping out. If someone went on vacation, a neighbor would feed their animals or keep an eye on their house. There was a quiet trust that made everything feel safe, like nothing truly bad could happen there. Even when I got older and moved into my own place nearby, that feeling never really went away. It still felt like the same kind of community. Familiar, predictable. The kind of place where you recognize every car that drives down the road and every face that passes by. Then a new neighbor moved in behind my property, near the area where I kept my horse. At first, it didn't seem like anything unusual. People move in and out all the time. I went over, introduced myself to the older woman living there, just like anyone would. She seemed polite enough. She told me her grandson would be moving in soon, bringing horses with him. That actually made me feel a little better about it. Someone else with animals usually means someone who understands boundaries, routines, and responsibility. I gave her my number, told her to reach out if she ever needed anything. It was just normal neighbor behavior. Something I had done plenty of times before without thinking twice. When her grandson finally moved in, things started to feel off almost immediately. It's hard to explain exactly what it was at first. There wasn't one big thing that stood out right away. It was more like a collection of small moments that didn't sit right. The way he moved, the way he looked at things, the way he didn't really interact like a normal person would. Then the small things started turning into something else. One of the first things he did was jump my fence and try to ride my horse. Not ask. Not introduce himself properly. Just climbed over like it was nothing and acted like he had the right to be there. That alone was enough to make me uneasy. Horses aren't toys, and they definitely aren't something you mess with on someone else's property. I confronted him about it, and he brushed it off like it wasn't a big deal. After that, it didn't stop. He started setting up a chair near the fence line. Not just occasionally, but regularly. He would sit there and watch me whenever I went out to work or feed my horse. Not in a casual, passing way, but in a way that felt intentional, focused, like he was studying me. It made every trip outside feel different. Something that used to be routine suddenly became something I had to mentally prepare for. I would check before stepping out, look toward the fence, see if he was there. Sometimes he was, sometimes he wasn't. But even when he wasn't, the feeling stayed. Then the messages started. One night while I was sleeping during the day because I worked nights, my phone kept going off. I didn't see it until I woke up, but when I did, there were dozens of messages from him. Around 50, maybe more. They didn't make sense. He was ranting about my fence being 3 feet over onto his land, accusing me of things that weren't true, jumping from one topic to another like his thoughts weren't connected properly. I went to the window and looked outside. He was pacing along the fence line, back and forth, like he was waiting for me to come out. That was the moment it really shifted for me. This wasn't just a weird neighbor. This was something else. I didn't want to go out there alone, so I called my brother-in-law. He came over quickly, and we went outside together. The guy immediately became aggressive, saying things that didn't even sound like normal threats. At one point, he told us he would burn us alive. We called the police. They came out, talked to him, but in the end, they couldn't really do anything. No physical harm had been done yet. It was all just words, just behavior that didn't quite cross whatever line they needed it to cross. That same night, while I was at work, the messages got worse. He started saying I'd messed up, that I didn't understand what I had done, that things were going to happen because of it. It didn't feel like empty talk anymore. There was something in the way he said it that made it feel real. When I got home the next morning, I saw what he had done. My fence had been cut in 3 different places, not broken by accident, not damaged by weather, cut cleanly. And on top of that, he had put up caution tape, marking off what he claimed was his section. It looked like something out of a scene, not real life. Again, I called the police. Again, they came out. And again, nothing happened. Every time I reached out for help, it was the same cycle. He would disappear into his house, refuse to come out. And because of the level of what he was doing, it wasn't enough for them to take serious action. It was like he knew exactly how far he could go without crossing that line. So I got a restraining order. At the time, it felt like the only real option left. Some kind of official boundary that would force things to stop. But it didn't. If anything, it just shifted his behavior. He started targeting my neighbors too, especially women and older people. He would tell them things that weren't true, claim ownership over areas he had no right to, create problems where none existed. It was like he needed conflict, needed control, and he was looking for it wherever he could. One day, his grandmother's car was parked in a way that completely blocked my neighbors in. They couldn't get out, so they called to have it towed. That seemed like a small thing at the time, but it wasn't. Later that day, I left the house like normal. Nothing felt different yet. But when I came back that night, everything changed. I live on a private road with only one way in and out. People don't park on the street. No, everyone has long driveways, so the road itself stays clear. As I drove up, I noticed tail lights near my driveway. At first, I didn't think much of it. Maybe someone was turning around, maybe visiting someone. But as I got closer and passed by, I realized it was him. He was sitting there, waiting. The feeling that hit me in that moment was immediate and overwhelming. Something deep, instinctive. The kind of feeling that tells you something is very wrong before your mind has time to process it. I didn't stop. I kept driving, planning to turn around and leave, but when I tried to make the turn, I didn't get it right. It wasn't a clean movement, and I had to put the car in reverse to correct it. That's when I heard it, his engine. He floored it. There was no hesitation. He drove straight into my car, hitting it from the side with his truck. The impact was violent, loud, and sudden, and he didn't stop there. He kept pressing the gas, pushing my car with his, forcing it back before finally pulling away and driving up into his driveway like nothing had happened. I sat there for a second, not fully understanding what had just happened. Then everything hit at once. I called 911. I texted my sister and my brother-in-law, trying to explain as quickly as I could. The dispatcher told me to leave, to get somewhere safe. But I couldn't move. I was in shock, frozen between what had just happened and what might happen next. My sister and brother-in-law got there within minutes. The police didn't. While we were waiting, he came back, this time on foot. He walked toward us calmly at first, talking about things that made my stomach drop. He said he wanted to feel his knife going through my skin, talked about my blood, like it was something he was already imagining. Then he rushed me. It happened so fast I didn't have time to react. He grabbed me by my arms and shoulders, lifted me off the ground like I weighed nothing, and started slamming my head into my car over and over. Everything blurred. The sound, the pain, the confusion, and then nothing. I lost consciousness. The only reason I'm here is because my brother-in-law was there. He pulled his gun, and that was enough to break whatever the guy was focused on. He dropped me, turned away, and ran back to his house. By the time the police finally arrived, it was over. They took him in, and for a moment it felt like maybe that was the end of it. But it wasn't. The part that still stays with me the most is realizing how close it came to being worse. The gate near my horse had already been cut. If he had been thinking clearly, if he had chosen a different approach, he could have waited there. I would have gone out alone like I had so many times before, not expecting anything, and I wouldn't have had anyone there to help me. That thought doesn't go away. It sits in the back of everything. A quiet reminder of how things could have ended differently. What makes it harder is knowing that he's already out. After everything, after the threats, the damage, the attack, he served about a year and is now on probation. The charges that felt like they matched what happened didn't stick. Things were reduced, argued down, reshaped into something smaller than what it felt like in the moment. And life keeps moving. But it doesn't go back to what it was. Once something like that happens, the feeling of safety doesn't return the same way. You start noticing things you didn't before. You think about situations differently. You prepare in ways you never had to. And you understand, in a way you didn't before, how quickly a normal life can shift into something else entirely. Sorry to pause for just a moment. If this is your first time here, welcome. I hope you're enjoying the calm so far. If you'd like more nights like this, true stories, gentle rain, no interruptions, please subscribe to Lacuna Noir. It really helps me keep creating these peaceful experiences for you. and tap the bell so you're here every time a new story arrives in the dark. Now, back to the story. I met her online at a time when that still felt a little uncertain, like you never really knew who you were talking to on the other side. At first, it seemed normal enough. We started with messages, then moved on to phone calls. It went on for a couple of months, long enough to feel like I had some idea of who she was. She sounded real. Her voice matched the way she texted. There was nothing obviously fake about it. We talked about regular things, daily life, random thoughts, little details that make conversations feel natural. There were no big warning signs at the beginning. If anything, it felt like something that might actually turn into something real. That's what made it easy to keep going, easy to ignore the small things that didn't quite line up. After a while, we decided to meet, or at least we tried to. She lived in another city, not too far, but far enough that it required planning. We would set a date, talk about what we'd do, where we'd meet. It always felt like it was finally going to happen. But then, every single time, she would cancel. Always on the day. At first, she would give reasons that sounded believable. Something came up, something went wrong, something she couldn't get out of. It happens. People get busy. Plans change. I tried to be understanding about it, but it kept happening. Every time we got close to actually meeting, something would stop it. And after a while, it started to feel off. Not in a dramatic way, just in that quiet way where something doesn't sit right, but you can't fully explain why. I started thinking maybe she wasn't real. It's not an unusual thought in that kind of situation. You hear about it all the time. People pretending to be someone else, using fake pictures, creating a version of themselves that doesn't exist. The fact that she kept canceling made it feel like that might be what was going on. When I brought it up, she didn't get defensive the way I expected. Instead, she said she was just nervous. She told me she wasn't used to meeting people like this, that the idea of it made her anxious. It sounded honest, maybe even a little vulnerable. And then she did something that made it harder to doubt her. She sent me a train ticket. Not just any ticket, but an open-ended one. Something I could use whenever I wanted, without needing to book a specific day. It came in the mail, physical proof that she was real, that she was serious about meeting. Along with it, she sent something else. Underwear. It felt strange, but at the time, I didn't question it the way I probably should have. I was young, and I wasn't really thinking clearly. It felt like a mix of reassurance and something more personal, like she was trying to show she was genuine in her own way. Then she told me what she wanted me to do. She said not to tell her when I was coming. Instead, she wanted me to pick a random day, use the ticket, and just show up. Once I got to her city, I was supposed to call her and tell her I was at the train station. Looking back, that should have been the moment I stopped. But I didn't. At the time, it felt almost exciting, spontaneous. Like something out of a story where things just work out in an unexpected way. I didn't think about the risks. I didn't think about how unusual it actually was. I just went. I picked a day, got on the train, and traveled to her city without telling her. The whole way there, I was building it up in my head, wondering what she would be like in person, how it would feel to finally meet after all that time. When I got to the station, I called her. No answer. I tried again. Still nothing. At first, I thought maybe she was busy. Maybe she hadn't seen the call yet. I waited for a bit, standing there, watching people move around me, feeling that initial excitement slowly turn into something else. Minutes passed. then more. Eventually, it became clear she wasn't going to pick up. I went home feeling confused more than anything else. Not just annoyed, but unsettled in a way I couldn't quite explain. The whole situation didn't make sense. Why go through all that effort, send the ticket, create that setup, and then just not show up? I didn't contact her again for a couple of days. Part of me was frustrated. Part of me just didn't know what to say. It felt like there was no point in reaching out after that. Then she contacted me. Her tone was different, more direct, less like the person I had been talking to before. She told me something I wasn't expecting at all. She said she was a convicted killer. At first, I didn't take it seriously. It sounded too extreme, too out of place compared to everything we had talked about before. It felt like something someone would say to shock you, or maybe as some kind of strange excuse. But then she explained. She said she had killed her husband, that he had been abusive, that one night, while he was sleeping, she hid a pair of scissors under her pillow and stabbed him multiple times. The way she said it wasn't dramatic. It wasn't emotional. It was calm, almost matter of fact, like she was describing something that had already been processed and accepted. That was the part that stayed with me. Not just what she said, but how she said it. After that, I looked it up. At first, I wasn't sure what I was even searching for. Just pieces of what she had told me, trying to see if anything matched. And then I found it. A case, details that lined up, a picture. It was her. Seeing that changed everything. It took it out of the realm of something abstract and made it real in a way that's hard to describe. This wasn't just someone saying something shocking. This was something that had actually happened. After that, I didn't continue talking to her. There didn't feel like there was anything left to say, but even now, years later, I still think about it sometimes. Not constantly. Not in a way that affects my daily life, but in those quiet moments when your mind drifts back to things you never fully understood. I think about that day at the train station. About how I was there, in her city, exactly where she told me to be. And she didn't show up. I wonder why. Was she scared? Did she change her mind at the last moment? Or was there something else she had planned? It's impossible to know. Part of me wants to believe the simpler explanation, that she was someone who had been through something extreme, something that changed her in ways I couldn't fully understand, and she was trying, in her own way, to move forward. That when it came down to actually meeting, it became too real, too overwhelming, and she backed out. But there's another possibility, too. One that's harder to ignore once it crosses your mind. That the situation wasn't as random as it seemed. That the way she set it up, the idea of me showing up without warning, alone, in a place where she knew the layout, and I didn't. That it wasn't just about nerves. I don't know which one is true. And I probably never will. All I know is that I was there, exactly where she wanted me to be. And for whatever reason, she chose not to come. And sometimes, when I think about it too long, I can't help but feel like that decision might have mattered more than I'll ever understand. I still remember the way that day felt, even though at the time I didn't understand why it stayed with me. It started like any normal school day. Nothing felt different. Nothing stood out. I got on the bus in the morning, went through classes, and by the time the day ended, I was just thinking about getting home like always. Our neighborhood was quiet, the kind of place where not much ever happened. You knew the houses, the streets, the small details that made everything feel familiar. The bus route was always the same. And there was one particular stop where a few of us would get off. Right at the corner of that stop, there was a house. It wasn't special in any way. Just another house you passed every day without thinking about it. That's why it stood out so much when things were suddenly different. When the bus pulled up that afternoon, I could already see something was wrong. Before the doors even opened, I noticed the flashing lights. Police cars lined up along the street, more than I had ever seen in one place in our neighborhood. There was caution tape stretched around the property, bright and impossible to ignore. And on top of that, there were news trucks parked nearby, cameras set up, people moving around in a way that made it clear something serious had happened. It didn't feel real at first. Everyone on the bus went quiet in that way people do when they're trying to take something in all at once. Kids started looking out the windows, trying to get a better view, whispering to each other, asking questions no one could answer. The bus driver didn't say much, just stopped like usual and opened the door. When I stepped off, everything felt different. The air itself seemed heavier, like something had shifted in a way I couldn't explain. The house that had always been just part of the background was now the center of attention. Police officers were moving around, some standing near the tape, others going in and out of the house. The front door was open, and there was this sense that whatever had happened was still unfolding. At that age, I didn't really know how to process it. I just knew it wasn't normal. There wasn't any information right away. No one was explaining anything to us. It was just something we had to see and then walk away from. I remember glancing at the house one more time before heading home, trying to figure out what could possibly have caused that kind of scene. But there were no answers, not until later. That night, I remember sitting in front of the TV, watching the news in a way I usually didn't. It felt more important than anything else that might have been on. There was a part of me that needed to know, needed to understand what I had seen earlier. That's when the details came out. The house had been foreclosed. That alone didn't mean much to me at the time, but I understood enough to know it meant something had gone wrong for the person living there. The bank had sent a cleaning crew to go through the house, to clear it out, get it ready for whatever came next. When the crew got there, they noticed the smell. That was the first real sign that something wasn't right. It wasn't just a bad smell, not something you could ignore or explain away easily. It was strong enough that they knew something was wrong before they even fully entered the house. That's when they called the police. What the police found was something no one in our neighborhood had expected. There was a body inside. It had been there for months. From what the report said, the man who had lived there had been dead for around 6 months. His body had been left in a closet, hidden away in a place no one would casually check. Over time, it had decomposed to the point where the smell had eventually spread through the house, but not in a way that had been obvious to anyone outside. That was the part that stayed with me. 6 months, half a year. And no one had noticed. The man had been divorced, living alone. There wasn't anyone checking in on him regularly, no one expecting to see him or hear from him. In a quiet neighborhood where everyone seemed to know each other, somehow he had still slipped through unnoticed. As more details came out, it became even worse. It wasn't a natural death. He had been involved with some kind of drug dealers. The exact details weren't clear to me at the time, just that it was something dangerous, something that had gone wrong. They had killed him, then wrapped his body up in a carpet and brought him back into the house. They left him there, in the closet, like it was nothing. The idea of that was hard to understand. Not just the act itself, but the thought process behind it. That someone could do something like that and then just walk away, leaving him there as if it didn't matter. Eventually they were caught. They had been driving his car, trying to get away, moving across state lines. That's how they were found. In a way, it gave the story some kind of ending, some form of justice. But it didn't change what had already happened. It didn't change the fact that for months that house had been sitting there, quiet and normal on the outside, while something completely different existed inside. After that, I couldn't look at the place the same way. Even when everything was cleaned up, when the police were gone and the tape was taken down, the feeling didn't go away. The house looked the same as it always had, but it didn't feel the same anymore. For a long time, I refused to walk on that side of the street. It wasn't something I really talked about. It just became a habit. I would cross over without thinking, putting distance between myself and that house, even during the day. It wasn't about logic. I knew on some level that there wasn't anything there anymore. But it didn't matter. The idea of what had been there was enough. At that age, it was easier to think of it as something being wrong with the place itself. Like it had absorbed something from what had happened, something that didn't belong in a normal neighborhood. I remember thinking it was haunted. Even if I didn't fully believe it in a serious way, it just felt like the simplest explanation for the feeling I couldn't shake. As I got older, I understood it differently. It wasn't about ghosts or anything like that. It was about realizing how close something like that had been. How something so extreme, so far outside what I thought was possible in a place like that, had been right there all along, just behind a door, hidden in a space no one thought to look. It changes the way you see things. It makes you realize that normal doesn't always mean safe. That quiet neighborhoods can still hold things you would never expect. And that sometimes the scariest part isn't what you can see. It's what you don't notice at all. Even now, when I think back on it, that image comes first. The caution tape, the police cars, the feeling of stepping off the bus and knowing something was wrong before I had any idea what it was. And the understanding that came later that for months, that house had been sitting there, looking completely ordinary, while something inside it had already gone very, very wrong. I've known him for as long as I can remember. We met back in kindergarten, at that age where friendships don't need effort or explanation. You just end up next to someone, share a few moments, and somehow that turns into something that lasts for years. With us, it never felt like something we had to maintain. We didn't need constant contact or daily conversations. Even when life pulled us in different directions, there was always that quiet understanding that things were still the same. Because of that, when I think back to that time, it doesn't feel distant. It doesn't feel like a story I heard about later or something that happened far away. It feels close, like something that came right up to the edge of my own life without warning. He was in Santa Barbara when the shooting happened. At first, I didn't know anything about it. It started the way a lot of things do now, with small pieces of information showing up here and there. Headlines, posts, people mentioning that something was happening somewhere. At that point, it still felt far away. Just another event unfolding in a place that didn't directly involve me. I remember coming across a live thread that morning. People were posting updates as they came in, trying to figure out what was going on. It was messy, incomplete, and hard to follow. At first, I read through it the same way I would read anything online. Curious, but not emotionally connected to it. Then the details started to become clearer. Specific locations, street names, descriptions of where things were happening. And slowly, something started to line up. That's where he was. it didn't hit all at once. It was more like a slow realization that kept building. At first, your mind tries to push it away. It tells you it's probably not the exact same area, that it's just nearby, that you're connecting things that aren't really connected. But the more you read, the more everything matches, until there's no room left for doubt. He was there, right in the middle of it. And there was nothing I could do. That feeling is hard to describe unless you've experienced it. It's not loud or chaotic. It's quiet, but constant. You keep refreshing the page, looking for updates, hoping for something that gives you clarity. You check your phone over and over, expecting a message that doesn't come. And until it does, your mind fills in the gaps. You start imagining things you don't want to imagine. Where they might be, how close they might be. What could be happening at that exact moment? And once those thoughts start, they don't really stop. Time feels different when you're in that state. Slower, heavier. Every minute stretches longer than it should. At some point, more information came out. He hadn't just been in the same city. He had been right there. Close enough that it wasn't just something he heard about afterward. It wasn't something distant that he could process from the outside. His friend, his roommate, had been shot in front of him. And that's the detail that never really leaves. I've tried to picture it before, but it doesn't fully make sense from the outside. Moments like that don't follow logic. They happen too fast, too suddenly. It's all timing, chance. Small differences that end up meaning everything. Somehow he made it out. When I finally heard from him, the relief hit all at once. It wasn't gradual. It was like something that had been building quietly inside me, suddenly released. He was alive. That was the only thing that mattered in that moment. But surviving something like that doesn't mean it's over. Not really. He came back home not long after. One of the first things he did was come over to my place. There wasn't any big plan behind it. No long message beforehand. He just showed up. And even before he said anything, I could tell something was different. It wasn't obvious in a dramatic way. He didn't look completely changed. He didn't act like a different person. But there was something in the way he carried himself, a kind of weight that hadn't been there before. Like part of him was still somewhere else, still trying to catch up with what had happened. We didn't talk about it right away. There are moments like that where words don't come easily, where both people know what happened, but neither knows how to start. So you sit there, letting the silence exist without forcing anything into it. After a while, he asked my family if he could learn how to use our firearms. It caught me off guard, even though it made sense in its own way. Growing up, that had never been something he showed interest in. It wasn't part of who he was, but now it felt different. At the time, I didn't question it. It felt like something he needed, even if I couldn't fully explain why. Looking back, it felt like he was trying to take something back. When something like that happens, it changes how you see the world. It removes that quiet belief that things will be okay just because they usually are. It forces you to see how quickly things can turn, how little control you sometimes have. Maybe learning how to handle a weapon gave him a sense of control again. Not in a reckless way, but in a way that made him feel less exposed, less vulnerable. Over time, that shift showed up in other parts of his life, too. He got into hunting. At first, it seemed like a big change, but the more I thought about it, the more it felt connected. It wasn't just about hunting. It was about awareness, about paying attention to your surroundings, understanding what's around you, being prepared. It required focus, and maybe that focus helped him deal with things in a way that nothing else could. What stood out the most, though, was how he kept moving forward. He didn't let that moment completely take over his life. He stayed on track with what he wanted to do. He pushed through school, finished college, and ended up getting a degree in microbiology. That's not something easy to do under normal circumstances. It takes discipline, consistency, a kind of quiet determination that doesn't fade easily. And he had that. I've always respected that part the most, because it would have made sense if things had gone differently. If that experience had pulled him off course, changed everything in a negative way. But it didn't. He adjusted in his own way, made changes where he needed to, and kept going. That doesn't mean it didn't affect him. It's the kind of thing that stays with you, even if you don't talk about it, even if you learn how to live around it. Every now and then, I still think about that day, about sitting there, reading updates, I feeling that quiet fear build while not knowing what was happening to him, about how close everything came to turning out differently, and about how it didn't. He made it out. He came back. He found his own way to deal with what happened, even if it meant changing parts of himself along the way. I don't think anyone fully moves on from something like that, but you can move forward. And when I think about everything, that's what stays with me the most. Not just what happened, but what came after. I remember that day in a way that feels sharper than most other memories, like something that never really fades, no matter how much time passes. It didn't start as anything important. In fact, it began in the most normal and forgettable way possible, which is probably why it hit so hard later. The day before everything happened, I had been casually scrolling through social media, not really paying close attention to anything. It was just one of those routine moments where you check in on what people are doing, maybe like a few posts, and move on. That's when I saw her post. It was simple, nothing dramatic, just a photo from a concert, bright lights, a big crowd, that kind of energy you can almost feel through the screen. She looked happy, excited, completely in the moment. There was a geotag on the post, the name of the music festival. I remember noticing it for a second, thinking something like, "Oh, that looks fun," and then just moving on. There was no reason to think anything more about it. People go to concerts all the time. It felt normal, safe, like any other event. At that time, it didn't stand out at all. The next day started just like any other day, too. There was nothing in the air that hinted at what was about to happen. I was going through my routine, doing small things, probably checking my phone here and there like always. Then I started seeing updates about a shooting in Las Vegas. At first, it didn't fully register. Unfortunately, news like that appears often enough that your mind doesn't immediately connect it to anything personal. It feels distant, like something happening far away to people you don't know. I remember opening one of the news updates and starting to follow along as more information came in. It was confusing at first. Reports were unclear. Details were still coming together. There were mentions of a concert, a large crowd, chaos. I kept reading, trying to understand what exactly was happening. And then slowly something started to click in my mind. It wasn't immediate. It was more like a quiet realization, building in the background, something that didn't want to fully form but kept pushing forward anyway. I saw the name of the event mentioned in one of the updates, the same name I had seen on her post the day before. That was the moment everything changed. It felt like the ground dropped out from under me. My mind went from distant curiosity to full panic in seconds. I remember staring at my phone, reading the words again and again, hoping I had misunderstood something. But the more I read, the clearer it became. This wasn't just any concert. it was the same festival, the same place where she had been. Suddenly, it wasn't distant anymore. My first instinct was to check her Instagram again. I opened her profile so quickly, my hands already starting to shake. I scrolled, looking for anything new, any sign that she was okay. But there was nothing. No new posts, no updates, nothing to reassure me. That silence felt louder than anything. My heart started racing. I couldn't think straight. I kept refreshing the page as if something might magically appear if I tried enough times, but it stayed the same. That same post from the day before, frozen in time, now carrying a completely different weight. I switched to Facebook next, hoping maybe she had posted something there. It felt like every second mattered. The wait between each click felt too long, like time was stretching in the worst possible way. When her profile finally loaded, I scanned it quickly, almost afraid of what I might see. And then I found it. There was a post, recent, just minutes old at the time. I remember reading it over and over again because my mind struggled to process the words. She had written that people in the crowd had helped her and her boyfriend get over a wall to escape the main area. It wasn't detailed, it wasn't long, but it was enough. She was alive. The relief didn't come all at once. It wasn't a simple feeling of, everything is okay now. It was mixed with so many other emotions that it became overwhelming. My whole body reacted before my mind could catch up. I started shaking, my hands unsteady, my chest tight. Tears came without warning, and I couldn't stop them. Even though I now knew she had made it out, the situation still felt terrifying. The news was still coming in, and it was getting worse. More reports of injuries, more confirmations of lives lost. The numbers kept rising, and each update made the situation feel heavier and more real. I kept thinking about how close she had been to all of it. The idea that just hours before, I had casually looked at her post without a second thought made it even harder to process. That same place, filled with music and excitement, had turned into something unthinkable, and she had been right there in the middle of it. I tried to imagine what she must have experienced, but it felt impossible. The fear, the confusion, the desperate need to escape. The fact that strangers in the crowd had helped them get over that wall stuck with me. In a moment of complete chaos, people still found a way to help each other. That thought brought a strange kind of comfort, even in the middle of everything. But at the same time, I couldn't stop thinking about how easily things could have gone differently. That's what made it so hard to settle down even after knowing she was safe. The what-ifs kept coming. What if she had been in a different spot? What if she hadn't been able to get out in time? What if no one had been there to help? Those thoughts didn't have answers, and that made them even more difficult to deal with. I stayed glued to my phone for hours after that, watching updates, reading stories, trying to understand the full scope of what had happened. Each new piece of information added to the weight of it all. It wasn't just a headline anymore. It was something personal, something that had almost taken someone I cared about. Even after the initial shock started to fade, the feeling didn't fully go away. It lingered in a quiet, heavy way. I kept going back to that moment of realization, the exact second when everything shifted from normal to terrifying. It replayed in my mind over and over again. There was something deeply unsettling about how quickly life could change. One day, you're looking at a happy photo from a concert. The next day, you're wondering if that same person is still alive. There's no warning, no clear line between safety and danger. It just happens, and all you can do is react. What stayed with me the most was that feeling of helplessness. When I realized she might be in danger, there was nothing I could do. I couldn't call her and expect an answer. I couldn't reach her or help her in any way. All I could do was wait. Wait for an update. Wait for any sign that she was okay. And that waiting felt unbearable. It's a kind of fear that's hard to explain unless you felt it. It's not just worry. It's deeper than that. It's the realization that someone you care about is in real danger, and you are completely powerless in that moment. Even after everything settled, that feeling stayed with me. I never forgot what it felt like to sit there, refreshing pages, hoping for something, anything, that would tell me she was safe. And even though I got that confirmation, even though she made it out, the experience changed something in me. It made everything feel a little less certain. Moments that once felt normal now carried a different weight. Seeing people post from events, concerts, crowded places, it doesn't feel as simple anymore. There's always a small part of me that remembers that day, that feeling, that sudden shift from normal to fear. And I think that's what makes it so lasting. It wasn't just about what happened. It was about how quickly everything changed and how deeply it affected me even from a distance. It showed me how fragile things can be, how quickly you can go from feeling safe to feeling completely out of control. I still think about her post sometimes, that image of her smiling at the concert, completely unaware of what was coming. It feels like a snapshot of a moment right before everything changed, not just for her, but for so many people. And I don't think I'll ever forget the feeling of realizing she was there in the middle of it, and all I could do was wait and hope for the best. I remember coming across this story late at night, the kind of time when everything already feels a little heavier and your thoughts don't have much to distract them. I wasn't even looking for something disturbing. It just appeared, like so many things do online, mentioned in passing in a video. I think it was from Alan Moore being quoted in the same discussion, or at least that's what stuck with me later. At the time, though, I didn't expect what I was about to hear. It started off like a lot of true crime stories do. A quiet neighborhood, a normal-looking house, the kind of place where nothing ever seems out of place. A suburb where people go about their lives, where neighbors wave to each other, where everything feels safe on the surface. That's what made it harder to process. There was nothing about it that suggested something so deeply wrong could be happening inside. The story was about a family. From the outside, they looked ordinary. Just another household. Nothing that would draw attention. But inside that house, something unthinkable was taking place, hidden from everyone around them. Their only child, completely dependent on them, was being treated in ways that go beyond what most people can even imagine. As I listened, it became harder to separate myself from it. At first, it felt distant, like just another story being told. But the details started to build, slowly at first, then all at once. And each detail made it harder to stay detached. The footage is what made it feel real. After everything had already happened, after it was too late, someone went through the family's computer. I remember hearing that it was their landlady, someone who probably had no idea what she was about to find. She must have expected something normal, maybe personal files, maybe nothing important at all. Instead, she found recordings, footage from inside the house. That's when the story stopped feeling like something you could keep at a distance. The cameras had captured moments that should never have existed. Not accidents, not misunderstandings. Clear, deliberate actions. The kind that make you question how anyone could do something like that to another human being, especially a child. One of the images that stayed with me was the child being left outside in the swimming pool. It wasn't just being outside. It was the way it was described. The cold, the shivering, the helplessness of being left there with no one coming to help. You can try not to picture it, but your mind fills in the gaps anyway. The silence of the night, the water, the cold air, and a child who should have been safe instead being left to suffer. Then there were the things about food. Something so basic, something every child depends on, turned into another form of cruelty. Being given food that wasn't even safe to eat. Moldy, rotten, something that no one should ever have to consume. It wasn't neglect in the sense of forgetting. It felt intentional, like part of a pattern. Like every basic need was being twisted into something harmful. The more I heard, the worse it became. There were mentions of restraints, devices used to keep the child in place. Not for safety, not for care, but for control. The idea of being trapped like that, unable to move, unable to escape, is something that's hard to fully grasp, especially when it's happening over and over again. Not just once, not just in a moment of anger, but as part of everyday life inside that house. And then it reached the point where it became almost unbearable to listen to. The starvation. It wasn't something sudden. It was gradual, slow. The kind of thing that happens over time where every day things get a little worse and there's no one stepping in to stop it. No one noticing. No one realizing what was happening behind closed doors. The final moments described were in the shower. Weak, exhausted, beyond the point where the body can recover. And even then, there was no care, no attempt to save him. Just the end of something that should never have started in the first place. I remember pausing after hearing that part, and not because I didn't understand it, but because I didn't want to. There's a point where your mind tries to protect you, where it resists taking in anymore. But the story didn't stop there. What happened afterward was just as disturbing. The way they tried to deal with what they had done. The lack of humanity, even after everything. It wasn't just about the abuse anymore. It was about how completely detached they had become from any sense of right and wrong. By that point, it didn't feel like a story anymore. It felt like something heavy, sitting in your chest. Something you couldn't easily shake off. I remember thinking about the neighbors. People who probably lived just a few feet away, going about their lives, completely unaware. Maybe they heard something once or twice and dismissed it. Maybe they noticed nothing at all. That's what makes it so unsettling. These things don't always happen in dark, isolated places. Sometimes they happen in normal houses, on normal streets, right next to people who would never imagine something like that could be happening so close. Eventually, the parents were caught. They were arrested, taken away, put through the system. And while there's some sense of justice in that, it doesn't really balance anything. It doesn't undo what happened. It doesn't change the fact that a child suffered in ways no one should ever have to. That's when the quote came back to me. The one from Alan Moore. It talks about how people believe in big conspiracies because it's more comforting. The idea that there's some hidden group controlling everything. Some explanation that makes the world feel ordered, even if it's in a dark way. Because the alternative is harder to accept. The truth is that things like this don't happen because of some grand plan. They happen because of people, because of choices, because of moments where someone decides to act in a way that causes harm and no one stops them. Because the world doesn't always step in when it should. Because sometimes there is no control, no system catching everything before it's too late. That's the part that stays with you. It's not just the details of what happened, although those are hard enough to forget. It's the realization that there isn't always a reason that makes it easier to understand. There isn't always a clear explanation that brings comfort. Sometimes, terrible things happen simply because they can. I think that's why people are drawn to horror stories. Not just for fear, but for structure. In a horror story, there's usually something you can point to. A cause, a pattern, something supernatural or unnatural that explains what's going on. Even if it's frightening, it still has rules. It still makes a kind of sense within its own world. But real life doesn't always work that way. Real horror is often quieter. It hides. It doesn't announce itself. It doesn't follow rules that make it easier to understand. And sometimes it happens in places where you would never expect it. That's why stories like this are so hard to process. They don't give you distance. They don't let you separate yourself completely. They remind you that the worst things aren't always fictional. They exist, and they happen more often than people would like to believe. And yet, people still write and share horror stories. Maybe not just to scare each other, but to cope. To take something that feels overwhelming and shape it into something that can be understood even a little. To face fear in a controlled way, instead of being blindsided by it in real life. Because the truth is, real horror doesn't need to be exaggerated. It's already there. It exists in moments that don't make headlines, in places people don't think to look, in situations that go unnoticed until it's too late. And while it's difficult to think about, it's also something that shouldn't be ignored. Stories like this aren't just disturbing. They're reminders. Reminders that behind normal appearances, there can be things we don't see, that neglect and abuse don't always show themselves clearly, that sometimes the signs are missed or misunderstood or never noticed at all. And maybe the hardest part is knowing that for the child in that story, there was no escape, no moment where things turned around, no sudden rescue, just a slow, painful progression that no one stopped in time. That's what makes it stay with you. Not just the horror of what happened, but the silence around it. The fact that it continued for so long without interruption. The idea that something so extreme could exist alongside everyday life without being seen. It changes the way you look at things, even in small ways. You start to realize that the world isn't as controlled or predictable as it sometimes feels. That there are gaps, places where things slip through, and that awareness can be uncomfortable. But it's also important because forgetting is easy. It's easier to push these things away, to treat them as rare, distant, or impossible. But they're not. And pretending they are doesn't help anyone. In the end, what stays with me isn't just the story itself. It's the feeling that comes with it. That quiet, heavy understanding that real horror doesn't need to be imagined. It already exists, in forms that are often more disturbing than anything fiction can create. And maybe that's why we tell stories at all. Not just to scare, but to remember. I remember hearing about this case in pieces, not all at once, and I think that made it even more unsettling. It didn't feel like a single story with a clear beginning and end. Instead, it felt like something that kept unfolding over time, each part darker than the last, each detail adding more weight to something that was already hard to process. The first part goes back to when he was still a teenager, around 16. At that age, most people are still trying to figure out who they are, still living under the structure of family and school, still far from becoming fully independent. But in his life, something terrible happened very close to home. 2 children from the neighborhood were found dead. It wasn't just that they had been killed. It was the way it happened that made the case so disturbing. They had been tortured. They had been hurt in ways that go far beyond what anyone should ever experience, especially children. And in the end, their lives were taken in a violent and deliberate way. For a long time, suspicion surrounded him. People in the area believed that he might have been responsible. Rumors spread, as they often do in cases like this. There were stories about his behavior, about possible motives, about things that may or may not have happened between him and the victim's family. One of the ideas people held on to was that this had been some kind of personal act, something driven by rejection or anger. Whether it was true or not, it stayed with him. But then, the truth took a different shape. His mother confessed. It was something no one expects to hear. The idea that a parent could be responsible for something like that, especially involving children so close to their own home, is hard to accept. There were mentions of mental health issues, explanations that tried to make sense of what had happened, but nothing really made it easier to understand. She was sentenced and spent years in prison. Even then, the case didn't feel settled in the minds of many people. Once suspicion takes hold, it doesn't always go away completely. And for him, that shadow seemed to follow him as he grew older. Years passed. On the surface, life moved forward. Time has a way of creating distance, making things feel like they belong to the past. But sometimes, that distance is only an illusion. In 2009, when he was 28, something happened that brought everything back into focus in the worst possible way. A woman went out for a jog. It was a normal activity. It's something people do every day without thinking twice about it. A routine, a way to clear your mind, to take a break from everything else. There was nothing unusual about it, nothing that would suggest it would turn into something dangerous. But somewhere along the way, she was taken. He forced her into the trunk of an older car, something from the 1980s. It wasn't a random detail. It became part of the story later, something she managed to describe in the short time she had to reach out for help. Because she did manage to make a call. That's one of the parts that stays with you the most. While she was trapped, while she knew she was in serious danger, she called her fiancé and a friend. You can imagine how difficult that must have been. The fear, the urgency, the realization of what was happening. And yet, she stayed clear enough to speak, to describe what she could, to try and give them something that might lead to her being found. She described him. She said he was large, physically overwhelming. She talked about his presence, the way he looked, the feeling she got from him. There was something in her words that made it clear she understood the situation fully. She knew she might not survive. She described the car, too. Every detail she could remember, every piece of information that might help someone find her. It was an act of strength in a moment where she had almost no control. She was doing everything she could to give herself a chance. And at the same time, she was saying goodbye. That's the part that's hardest to think about. The awareness in her voice. The understanding that this might be the last time she would speak to the people she loved. There's something deeply human about that moment, something that goes beyond fear. Search efforts began quickly. Because of her call, because of the information she provided, people knew something was wrong almost immediately. There was urgency. There was a real chance to find her in time. But even with all of that, it wasn't enough. She was found not long after, within about an hour. But by then, the worst had already happened. The injuries she had suffered made it clear that she had gone through something no one should ever have to endure. And in the end, her life was taken. There was another detail that made it even more devastating. She was 6 months pregnant. It added another layer to the tragedy, something that made the loss feel even heavier. It wasn't just one life that was taken, but two. A future that would never happen. A family that was changed forever in a way that can't be undone. When everything came together, when the person responsible was identified, it brought the past back into the present. The same individual who had been surrounded by suspicion years earlier was now clearly responsible for this. It's difficult to put into words what that realization means. On one hand, it confirms something people had feared before. On the other, it raises questions that don't have easy answers. What led to this? Could anything have been done earlier? Was there a moment where things could have gone differently? Those questions don't really have clear responses. What remains is the impact, the lives that were lost, the fear that spread through the community, the realization that something like this can happen in places that feel safe, that people who seem ordinary on the surface can carry something much darker underneath. It also changes how you think about time. We often believe that the past stays in the past, that events are contained within the moment they happen. But sometimes they're connected. Sometimes what happens early on is part of something larger, something that continues in ways no one fully sees at the time. And that's what makes stories like this so difficult. They're not just about one event. They're about patterns, about warning signs, about things that may or may not have been noticed. They force you to think about how much we actually understand about the people around us. In the end, what stays with you isn't just the violence or the details. It's the moments in between. A quiet neighborhood where something terrible happened years ago. A jog that started like any other. A phone call made in desperation, filled with both fear and hope. The idea that even with time, even with distance, some things don't simply disappear. They come back in ways that are even harder to face. And once you hear something like this, it doesn't really leave you. Not completely. It becomes one of those stories that sits in the back of your mind, reminding you that real danger doesn't always look the way you expect it to, and that sometimes the most ordinary moments can turn into something unimaginable. Look, if you're still watching, you already know what this channel is. No jump scares, no fake drama, just real stories about real people who survive things most of us can't even imagine. And that's scarier than any movie could ever be. If you want more of this raw, unfiltered truth, told the way it deserves to be told, subscribe to Lacuna Noir. We're not here to waste your time. We're here to tell the stories that actually matter. Thanks for listening. Now go get some sleep, if you can.